Warm welcome to Margaret Barker for this second talk for the Leap in the Dark series on the Tree of Life and Our Lady of the First Temple. Margaret.
Thank you, Marie-Elsa. Well, during our time this evening, I have three tasks to do. First is to introduce the Lady of the Temple, and this will be a new idea, I realize, to some of you, but there was an important female deity in the first temple in Jerusalem. She has been largely written out of the written texts and indeed out of many of the ways that the Old Testament is expounded. Second, the lady was represented by many things, but for our purposes this evening, we're going to talk about the Tree of Life, which was one of her symbols. And the Tree of Life in the temple was represented by the menorah, the 7-branch candlestick. And then third, this tree in a stylized form is found on the little lead tablet that I introduced you to 4 weeks ago. And the tree as it's set out on that lead tablet is clearly the ancestor of the tree that is the basis of the diagram in Kabbalah, the Sephirotic tree. So can we have the next slide, please? Now, there are many links between the Lady of the Temple and the Tree of Life. Many links. I can only give you a few this evening, otherwise you'll have the impression that I have turned a fire hose on you and you won't take anything in. But one of the fascinating things about this female deity is that she has many names, but many of these names in the Hebrew scriptures are not recognized as names because Hebrew doesn't have capital letters. And I'm sure if there had been capital letters in Hebrew, and these had been transferred into the other translations, for example, even into the English translations, and we had read Bibles that had wisdom with a capital W and great lady with capital letters, we might have read the Old Testament differently. But some of the names of this female deity are Ashratah. Now you'll find her in some of the Old Testament texts as Asherah. And Asherah is a deliberate later scribal editing technique so that the name of this dreadful abomination didn't appear in the holy texts. And Asherah is meant deliberately to associate her with the deities of neighboring countries, neighboring cultures, particularly the ones that are known or best known from Ugarit, which is just to the north. But if you look at where her name has survived outside the world of the editing scribes, so when you find it in graffiti, for example, it's not Asherah, it's Ashratah. And there you can see that this is a feminine form, and it means the one who makes you happy and the one who keeps you on the straight path. So she is the great guide. Another of her names is Wisdom, and she is the one who teaches. And if you look at the description of her teaching right at the beginning of the book of Proverbs, it's Da'at, which is knowledge, Chokhmah, which is wisdom, Binah, which is insight, and you'll recognize all those from the Sephirotic tree. And then another of her titles was the Great Lady, literally the Great Lady. And in heaven, she was the Queen Mother figure. We know that she was the heavenly mother of the kings of Ugarit. And there are several places in the Hebrew scriptures where you can read her in those texts also, but she's never actually emphasized. And then she's also known as the living one. But because she's a deity, sometimes she is in the plural. So she can be Chaya, the singular, or she can be Chayot, the plural. And you have to remember that the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, is a plural form. So there's nothing unusual. There's no special pleading or anything there. So she's a lady with many, many names, and those are just 4 of them. Right, next one. In Solomon's temple, the male and female divine figures were represented on earth by the king and his mother. Now, the king and queen in Jerusalem were not the king and his wife, because it was a polygamous society and he would have had many wives, but he only had one mother. And his mother was the queen. She was the queen mother, but she was the power, a very important figure. And she represented the great lady on earth. Her son was the Lord, and the Lord was present in the Davidic king in Jerusalem. One of his titles, you remember, was Emmanuel. And so, as far as we can see by reconstructing from what is left, the king and his mother were equally incarnations of heavenly beings. We tend to think only of the male as the incarnation. And things start to get very interesting when you say, well, this is where the roots of Christianity are. What about Mary? Now, the Heavenly Mother was represented within the temple by the 7-lamped menorah, and this was shaped like a golden almond tree. And if you look in the book of Exodus, chapter 24, towards the end, you will see detailed descriptions of the lamps and what the old Bible called the knobs and the branches. It's clearly a stylized almond tree. And it is interesting that the botanical name for an almond tree, amygdala, is clearly derived from the Semitic great mother, Aim Godola, Aim Mother Godola, great. So this has passed into the common heritage of European languages. The almond tree, the menorah, the Heavenly Mother, they're all there just under the surface. And so much of what we know or can know about the great lady and her tree is just underneath the surface. Now, in the temple courts, she was represented by an image on a pillar. And we know this because in Ezekiel chapter 8, Ezekiel has a vision, and in his spirit journey, he's taken back to the temple in Jerusalem, and he's taken into the court towards the north, and there he sees, and then the question is, what does he see? Because the image he sees was something that the editors of the Hebrew Bible thought really shouldn't be in a holy book, and so they changed the name. And all they did was insert into her title the letter Aleph, which actually is a silent letter. And so when you pronounce the two titles, they sound the same, but when you read them, they have been changed. And what you read in Ezekiel now is that he saw an image of the woman who provokes jealousy, which is an odd sort of name for anybody. But if you remove that silent Aleph, we have the woman who is the creator. She is a creator, and then according to the Greek translation, the Hebrew isn't entirely clear here, the Greek translation, that says that she was set on a pillar. So there is a lady on a pillar. Some of you will know the Spanish tradition of statues of Mary on a pillar, particularly in the great cathedral at Saragossa. Why on earth should you stand a lady on the top of a pillar? Well, there's your possible answer. Now, can we have the next one, please? Now, hundreds of these images have been found, and a larger version of these images may well have been what Ezekiel saw. These little figurines, on average about 6 inches tall, 15 centimeters, they're called Judean pillar figurines. They are not things of great beauty. They were probably, for domestic use, they were probably almost pilgrim souvenirs. And what you notice about these ladies, first of all, is that they have huge breasts, so they're clearly nursing mothers. And second, they have big eyes. And those are the only two real features of these things, except that they're not fertility symbols, because there's nothing below the waist, and you can see they're meant to stand on something, possibly a little pillar in your own home. So these are figurines that are meant to stand on a pillar. Some of them have traces of paint left on them, and it seems that they wore white, but their characteristics are that they are nursing mothers and they have big eyes. So let's look at the next one. Now, the golden menorah was the tree of life and also the tree of light. The tree of light, obviously, it had the 7 lamps on it. And when you go into the writings of the Jewish mystics like Enoch, the Slavonic book of Enoch, second Enoch as it's known, when Enoch is doing his traveling up through the heavens, he sees the tree of life and light, and it's fiery, and it's very, very interesting how they chose to represent the tree of life. It's a place where there is light. And the tree is linked to wisdom and to the royal family. Now, there's only one verse in the whole Old Testament that specifically links wisdom to the tree of life. But one verse that is absolutely clear and uncorrupted is all we need. This is the evidence. And that's Proverbs chapter 3, verse 18, the end of this wonderful poem about wisdom, which I will find and read to you. Proverbs 3, and this is the poem where wisdom herself is happy is the man who finds wisdom. It begins at 3:13, and it ends by saying, she is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called happy. And that word happy is wordplay on her name Ashrei, and she is Ashrah. So it says specifically in the book of Proverbs that she is the tree of life. And the great lady was the co-creator, which is what we expect from that editorial deviation in Ezekiel. And her role was to hold all things together. And the male creator separated into distinct kinds. So if you look at the first chapter of Genesis with this in mind, everything is separated out, separated out, separated out. And just at the beginning, it tells you that the Spirit of God was hovering over the whole process. And that hovering is a feminine participle, merachafet. It's the old style feminine participle. So the male creator kept things separate and distinct, and the female creator held all things together. And you have this very clearly in another of the great wisdom poems, which is Proverbs chapter 8. And there in verse 30, you have one of the many Hebrew words of which we're not sure of the meaning. You can define more or less what it means. one of the things you can do is go to the Greek translation and say, well, how did they understand it, when they're much closer than we are, of course, to the classical Hebrew. And the Greek translation, we don't know when the Greek translation of Proverbs was made, but certainly pre-Christian. And the Hebrew says, I was beside him like an Ammon. And the question is, what is an Ammon? And the Greek translator thought that an Ammon was someone who held all things together in harmony. And the Greek participle harmozousa, harmony maker. Now, this idea of the lady holding all things together is also present in Genesis chapter 1, where the first line, I'm sure you remember, in the beginning God created. And the great biblical scholar Origen, who was writing in the beginning of the 3rd century, so he died in 253 anyway, when he read his Old Testament, he didn't read that first word as in the beginning. He read it as by means of the net. And the holder of this net, of course, is the Spirit who is hovering over all creation a couple of lines down. So this idea of all things being held together by the lady or the Spirit is very much part of what is just underneath the surface of the Hebrew Scriptures. So let's look at the next one now, please. The next one, every part of this tree of life was significant and a part of the lady's presence. So first of all, she was the trunk of the tree. She wasn't the whole tree, she was the trunk of the tree. The branches of the tree were the Davidic kings in Jerusalem. And I'm sure you know that one of the titles for the Messiah was the branch. And that's an odd title for anyone if you don't know the image is that he was deemed to be a branch from the great tree of life. And then the oil from the wood of the tree of life was the anointing oil. And we know certainly from early Christian texts that the oil used in the temple imitated the perfume of what the tree of life oil was believed to be like. So all those elaborate spices of myrrh and cassia and cinnamon and so forth, you blend them together. They said that was to imitate the perfume of the great oil. And then the leaves of the tree were for healing. Well, we get that in the New Testament, Revelation 22. The wood was used for shuttles to weave holy cloth. Now, you pick that up in the collection of Jewish law, spelled Lore, we call the Mishnah. And there, when they are forbidding the cult of Asherah, it continued even to the time of Jesus. You were forbidden to make a shuttle out of wood from an Asherah tree. And then the fruit of the tree gave you wisdom, and the fruit transformed the recipients into angels. And there's a lovely poem in Ezekiel chapter 19, which describes how the great tree in Jerusalem was uprooted and cast into the desert, which of course is where she survived. But because she was uprooted and cast out, there were no more strong branches to be the kings in Jerusalem. So that's the second half of Ezekiel chapter 19. So let's look at the next one. Now, wisdom as the person who sits on the throne in heaven with the Lord. We assume it's a late text. It's only known fairly late. It might be a lot older. Solomon's prayer in the book of Wisdom, chapter 8, and these are just bits from it. He prays, give me the wisdom who sits by thy throne. And then a bit further down, with thee is wisdom who knows thy works and was present when thou didst make the world. So she's there at the very beginning. sent her forth from the holy heavens and from the throne of thy glory. Now let's look at the next one. This is a real treasure. Now, this is a double throne dated to the 8th century BC, so time of Isaiah. And if you look at it, the figure on the right, as we look at it, is a male figure and has a beard. And the figure on the left, so sitting to the right of the bearded figure, but to the left of our picture, is clearly a female figure. And that's the only surviving evidence we have for the throne, as it was known in Judah. And behold, it's a throne for two, mother and son. So let's move on now. I'm going to take you to the world of this great lady as it is depicted on the lead tablets. And I showed you this one 4 weeks ago. Remember, this is a drawing that, in fact, my daughter made. The original tablet is about the size of a bank card, very small indeed. And it is cast, it is not stamped or inscribed. And that means you can't add extra scratches or bits. This is as it was cast. This is as it was made. Now, if anyone says to me, what is it? The answer is, I don't know. If anyone says, how was it made? I don't know. But the fact is, it exists. I know it exists. I've held it in my hand. It's photographed, say the size of a bank card, and all these patterns are above the surface. Right, let's look at the next one. I'll show you a few. Here we are. Now remember, you read them in absolute matching pairs of mirror images. And if you take the solid line that I've drawn and you start with the black circle, and then you take it up and then down again, you get 4 letters, and they say Gevira, great lady. But because some of those letters can have 2 meanings, and this is the key to the code on these tablets, you have to know which letters mean 2 things. You can also read that round as Deborah, or a B, and that's important because the great lady's teaching was as sweet as honey. The B doesn't appear in the Bible, but my goodness, she's all over the lead tablets. And then if you read it with other alternative letters, it becomes Dovaka, she who joins in union. And we've had this before for the great lady. And then if you read the mirror image, starting at triangle on the left, you have she who flourishes or grows great, or with different vowels, it could be she who causes to flourish and grow great. So she is the nurturing mother figure. Right, let's look at the next picture. Now, here are some Kabbalah words that you will know. If you take the solid line from the black circle, and you go down from heaven, which is at the top of the tablet, to earth, which is at the bottom, and then go back to the middle, which is the Holy of Holies, you have Darath, which is knowledge. And if you take its mirror image down from the black triangle, on the left, down and then up, you have Binah, understanding. So very obvious pair, and it's one that survived right through into the Sephirotic tree. Now let's look at the next one. The next one, if you start from the black circle and go up, you have Netzach, which can mean glory or victory. Its mirror image on the right means Edut, which is a testimony or a witness. Again, it's pairs of words that make sense. Now let's go on to the next one. From about 900 BC, which is only 50 years after the temple was completed in the time of Solomon, there was a movement to remove the Great Lady from the temple. Now, we don't know what prompted this. We can only trace it very often with kind of shadows and interesting shaped holes in the Old Testament story. We do know that her image and the cult objects associated with her were removed many times, where the removal is described many times, but restoring her is not described. But the very fact that they had to take her stuff out several times show that it must have been restored. So there's something going on under the pages of the familiar Old Testament. And then the great account of the final purge under King Josiah in 2 Kings 23. That was in 623. Everything was removed. But the account is in coded language because it was an abomination even to mention her name. So when you read 2 Kings 23, you've got to read it with great suspicion and say, what are they not telling us here? What vowels have been changed? What letters that look similar have been substituted? And all this goes on. You know, if I had you here for a couple of hours on this topic alone, we could have a fascinating time. But let's press on. Let's see the next one. Now, the scribes who collected and edited the Hebrew scriptures, that's after the disaster of the destruction in 597 BC and 586, that's the Babylonian destruction, the scribes collected and preserved and edited because they were the people behind the last great purge, and they removed almost every trace of the Great Lady. But once you know how they worked, you can spot her underneath what the scribes have left. Now, sometimes there are clues in the other ancient translations. I've already mentioned how you can go to the old Greek translation and find out what it was that Ezekiel really saw in the temple. That old translation is called the Septuagint because that's the Greek for 70, and it was made by 70 scholars. Lovely story. It's a story, but it's called the Septuagint. And sometimes there are memories of the lady in other ancient texts. So it's not just the biblical text that's giving us the evidence. So let's go back now. Let's have the next picture. Go back now to Ezekiel. At the gateway of the inner court that faces north, there was the seat of the image of jealousy that provokes to jealousy. And underneath, I have put out for you in color the two key consonants, the Q and the N. If you add after the N an aleph, which you indicate by a comma, and I put that in blue. If you put in this silent letter, you get the word jealousy, and that is read with an I vowel at the beginning, kin'ah. But if you keep what was almost certainly the original, you have kona, different vowel, and that is a female creator. So you can see what happened there. And this word in Hebrew, that is the seat, in the Greek translation becomes a pillar. And those little figurines were clearly designed to stand on their own little pillars. And there is a strong suspicion that the great statue in the temple was a large and more beautiful and refined original that these little clay figurines copied. So let's see the next one. And here, this is an ancient hymn, Deuteronomy 33:2, an ancient hymn for the festival when the Lord became king in the midst of the tribes of Israel. This is the Davidic king. The tribes are assembled. And when the king has been consecrated, he becomes Emmanuel, so he's a divine being. And what you actually get in the Hebrew now, he came with flaming fire at his right hand. Now, the Hebrew given, I've put in red underneath. Red are the consonants of the texts. And you've got Eshtat, which you can divide up and make two words, Esh and Dat. Dat is a fairly late word in Hebrew, possible, and that can mean fiery law. And so you get fiery law coming through into the Latin, the Vulgate Latin. But the Hebrew letter D is almost identical to the Hebrew letter R. You can see there, I put them in, a dalet on the left, D, and a resh on the right, R. And so if you change the D in Eshtat to an R, what you have left is Ashrata, the original spelling of the lady's name. And so when the Lord comes as king in the midst of his tribes, he has Ashrata at his right hand, which is exactly where she appears in that little damaged statue I showed you of the king and his mother on their throne. And that's how you can reconstruct what the scribes did, and archaeology will support it, which is really rather nice and interesting. Now, let's have the next one. This is Ben Sira. Ben Sira is a teacher of wisdom in Jerusalem around 200 BC, something like that. And he knew that wisdom described herself as a tree. And Ben Sira chapter 24 is a wonderful poem where wisdom describes herself. This is the earliest evidence we have for it, but it doesn't mean to say that it was written by Ben Sira at that time. He could have been recording something everyone had known for years. We just don't know. But this is what he says. He says, wisdom describes herself as a tree. In the holy tabernacle, I ministered before him. So she's a priest. That's the word for leading a liturgy. So the lady is a priest in the temple. I don't recall this evidence ever surfacing in the debate about women priests, but who needs evidence? Anyway, then we have, I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon and like a cypress on the heights of Hermon. I grew tall like a palm tree at En Gedi and like rose plants in Jericho. Like a beautiful olive tree in the field and like a plane tree, I grew tall. So she's tall in all of these things. She's a tall tree, but she's no particular tree. All sorts of tree imagery is used to describe the lady. And if we see the next one, please, this is how she appears right at the end of the book of Revelation. Then John at this point is being shown around by the angel who guides him. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life. This is another symbol of the lady. Bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb. Now I've hyphenated that because that was the idiom to show that God and the Lamb, the human being, have become one. They don't explain the process, they simply state the result. So the water flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river was the tree of life. Now, this is all very complicated Greek and the text is damaged. But the tree has 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nation. So there, Christian visionary St. John knows all these characteristics of the tree of life, and he knows that the throne of God and the Lamb is actually there under the tree of life. And we know from Jewish legends and traditions at the time that this was how they imagined it or remembered it. So let's look at the next one now. This slide and the next one are from the Mishnah, and the Mishnah compiled about 200 CE, something like that, and it's a record of custom and practice in the Second Temple Judaism. And they clearly had a problem, even in the time of Jesus, with Asherahs. People were still making them and using them. And so Mishnah Avodah Zarah, that means foreign worship. What is an Asherah? Any tree under which there is an idol, any tree that is worshipped, the definition. None may sit in its shadow. The shadow of the tree was very important, but I haven't got time to do that today. None may pass under it. So you might catch something nasty if you went near one of these trees. Nobody must benefit from the wood of an Asherah. It's forbidden to use it for baking because you made loaves for this lady, and part of her worship was making this special bread. And it was forbidden to use it for a shuttle for weaving because the fabric that you wove would be unclean. Then we're going to look at the next one. The next one, you couldn't use trimmings or prunings from an Asherah tree. A tree was pruned to a special shape for this. You couldn't use trimmings for the bunch of branches at the Feast of Tabernacles, the lulav as it's called. So if a palm branch was from an Asherah or from an apostate city, it is not valid. So these Asherah worshippers were still keeping the Jewish festivals. If a myrtle branch was from an Asherah from an apostate city, it's not valid. A willow branch was from an Asherah or an apostate city, it is not valid. And then later on, if the etrog, that's that citron fruit that they used, was from an Asherah or an apostate city, it was not valid. So these people who had Asherah trees and were also celebrating in all its details the Feast of Tabernacles. So how did they define themselves? Now let's see the next one. This is how early Christians, this is the Gospel of Philip, an early Christian text, first generation almost certainly. It's now extant, survived, we got it only in Coptic, but the wordplay and the style and all sorts of things show that it was a translation from a Hebrew, possibly Aramaic original, but certainly an original in a Semitic language. The text is damaged, but two trees grow in paradise. The one bears animals, that is mortals. The other bears men, that is angels. That's simply their code. If you are a mortal, you're described as an animal, the sheep and the goats in Matthew's parable. If you're described as a man, it means you're an angel. And you remember in Matthew's parable, it's the Son of Man and his angels who come to judge sheep and goats. Adam ate from the tree that bears animals, and he became an animal or a mortal. If he had eaten from the tree, and then there's a hole in the text that bears men, angels, and then it's all gone. So implication is that if Adam had continued to eat from the tree of life, he would have remained an angel. Interesting implication. Can't be certain, of course. You can't press a case from silence or from the hole in the manuscript, but I think there's enough left from this one for us to be able to draw some interesting possibilities. Now, this is from the next one, please. This is from a Roman satirist, Juvenal, and he was writing in the early 2nd century, and there's a spelling mistake there. He's talking about a Jewish refugee in Rome, female refugee, so possibly from the war in 135, all the troubles that preceded it. And this woman was a poor woman. She was working as a street seller and a beggar. And she is described as an interpreter of the laws of Jerusalem, a high priestess of the tree, a trusted go-between or mediator of highest heaven. Now, this is a pagan, a non-Jew, and when he wants to satirize this Jewish woman refugee, he says, well, she calls herself a high priestess of the tree and a mediator with the highest heaven. And so what sort of devotees did the lady and her tree have in the early years of Christianity? It's a question we can't answer, but on the basis of that, we can certainly ask it. So let's look at the next picture. Next slide. This is the Akathist hymn to Mary, this version from the 6th century, but the imagery is much, much older. And because one, Mary is described as the vine whence springs a never withering branch. That's a direct reference to Ezekiel 19, the great lady who was uprooted and her branches withered. Tree of glorious fruit on which the faithful feed, wood of shady leaves where many shelter. Well, it's obvious where that's come from. And then a lamp of living light and the scent of Christ's fragrance. Again, it's very obvious where that's all come from. And all these things that had been said for centuries about the Queen Mother in Jerusalem and the great lady, the heavenly lady in the first temple, all these, and I mean all these, were transferred to Mary of Nazareth very early on. So let's look at the next one. Now, I'm going to show you now one or two examples of the great lady of the temple as she appears on one lead tablet. Remember, the tablets are red, matching pairs of words that must correspond exactly. No fudging, exactly. So let's see the first one. Then we can see how this, now here we are. On the right-hand side, you've got the black circle. If you read that down to the bottom and then up and up again, you have the word Alma, which is traditionally translated virgin, but the Hebrew could also mean the hidden lady or the eternal lady. And you will see that that line ends in a letter that looks like a Roman E on its side. If you take the other line, starting with the black triangle, take it down, exact mirror image, and then up, you get she who causes to know. And that pair of letters, the one that looks like an E on the left-hand side, and the one that looks a bit like a K, a capital K on the right-hand side, these are the two endings for feminine forms in Old Hebrew. And so when you get pairs of words that both end on those letters, they are describing the lady. So she is traditionally the virgin, the hidden and eternal lady. And modern translations of the Bible that translate Alma as young woman are just, well, destroying the tradition and should be ignored. Let's look at the next one. Now, the next slide, again, we have a pair about the lady. And this one might surprise you just a little bit. Starting at the top with the black circle, And we're moving around. Now, this is quite a complicated one. It's not the most complicated, but it's one of the more complicated. We're moving around, up, down, and then right up and back here to the right-hand side. That says Magdala, Magdalene, and that can also mean the exalted lady or the lady of the tower. So Mary Magdalene is actually an old title from the temple. She is the exalted lady, the lady of the tower. And the tower was what they called the Holy of Holies. If you look at the exact mirror image of that, starting with the black triangle, and follow that round exactly as a mirror image, same sequence, there you get the words for the sevenfold knowledge. So this Mary Magdalene, the lady of the tower, the exalted lady, is the one linked to the sevenfold knowledge which Enoch talks about in 1 Enoch 93, verse 10. Now, those of you who are interested in traditions about Mary Magdalene will know that there are many early traditions of Mary as the recipient of, Mary Magdalene as the recipient of special teaching from Jesus. Big question that rises from this is, was Mary Magdalene, exalted lady, in fact a title of honor for Mary of Nazareth? Now that is something for another occasion, but there's a lot of early evidence that Mary the exalted lady, Mary Magdalene, was actually a title for Mary of Nazareth, the mother of our Lord. So let's go on to the next one. Now, here we're starting at the bottom with the black circle. And here we have the lady enthroned. And we're going to follow that up, across, and down. And then if we look at the mirror image of that, which is the dotted line, and we go up and across and down, that is the lady who joins together or the lady who joins in pairs. And so we know that the lady on the throne is the one we've met before as the Ammon who joins together the creation. And here, and in fact in the next one also, you will see that those two lines intersect at the central lamp of the menorah. Now, there's a whole series of these patterns. Again, we could spend a long time on this, but patterns that intersect in the central lamp of the menorah tell us something about the mother of the Messiah, because the central lamp of the menorah represents the Messiah. But that's a different strand of Jewish tradition. And again, it's not something we can look at today. But here you have it, the Yoshevet, the lady enthroned, and the lady who joins in pairs. And there's another lead tablet, which I'm not going to show you, which has a stylized B on it. And if you find the title Lady Enthroned on that tablet, you find that the mirror image is Ashrata, the lady's name. So there's no question who we are talking about. Now let's look at the next one. This again, this is rather badly drawn, but you will see the solid line and the dotted line. If I'd drawn them carefully, they would have intersected at the lamp at the top. But there we go. Now the solid line from the circle at the bottom is the woman who weaves. And the woman who weaves is one of the images that is used for the lady of the temple. She is the one who weaves the creation. She holds all things together. The warp threads of creation are secured by the stone of her throne and so forth. Now the mirror image here the dotted line from the triangle up and across and down. That is the woman who draws water. Now you might think, what is the link between the woman who weaves and the woman who draws water? And those of you who know the infancy gospel of James, and indeed the tradition that you find in early church art and right through, is that the Annunciation to Mary, which we celebrated yesterday, of course, March the 25th, the Annunciation to Mary happened in 2 stages. At the first stage, the first time Mary heard the angel, she was drawing water. And she's very frightened at this, and she goes home and she sits and she takes up her spinning. And the second Annunciation is to the woman who is working her wool. And here you have the 2 images. They are should be intersecting at the lamp that represents the Lord, but they are in fact the 2 images given of Mary, the one who spins and weaves, and the one who gathers her water. And there she is, set out as 2 mirror images. Then let's see the next one. Here again, the lines intersect at the lamp, so there's something to do with the incarnation. We start at the top with the round black thing and then come down and across. We have Batsion, the daughter of Zion, or daughter Zion, I think is a better way to read it. The exact mirror image there, passing through, of course, the lamp of the Messiah, is the words, the woman who brings forth salvation. And there she is. Now, let's look at another one. Here, starting on the left-hand side with the black circle and moving around, we have Rachame, the compassionate one. The mirror image there from the black triangle moving around is Counselor, and that's a feminine form, the wise woman, and she is also the compassionate one. And compassionate one is one of the titles of the great lady as the mother of the Messiah. That's actually just under the text of Psalm 110, where it says, I have begotten you from the womb as the morning star, or some such thing. That womb should have a capital W, and it's the same as the name compassionate one, spelled the same way. So there she is again. She is the wise lady who is the womb of the Messiah. Let's look at another one. Now this one, this is one of my favorites actually, framing the menorah and starting on the left and reading round clockwise. So up to the top, down to the bottom, and then up again. That says Alleluia. And Alleluia can mean praise the Lord, or it can mean Lord appear. And when they sang various things in the temple, this was to encourage or to invoke the presence of the Lord. Now, if you look at the other way, anti-clockwise, round the same letters, or almost the same, from the black triangle, you have the transplanted one. What that is saying is when the tree is planted again in the temple, and we get a lot about this in the first book of Enoch, when the tree that has been uprooted is planted again in the temple, then the Lord appears. If you remember the end of the book of Revelation, St. John sees the tree of life again and the throne, and the Lord is there, and that tablet is in effect the happy ending of the book of Revelation. And then the last one I'm going to show you today, the next one, this is the most complicated one, so I've left it till last. This describes how the lady comes down from heaven. And I've done it in lots of colors, and I hope you will be able to follow it. First of all, if you start with the black circle and you read around the black circle anti-clockwise, that gives you the word for queen, or one of the words for queen. And so you can see from that shape that the queen here has come from the center of the highest heaven, way at the top of the tree, and she has flowed down, because if you read it the other way round, that is from the black square, the other way round, then this is about her flowing down or appearing. That word can mean both. So the red triangle is the queen, the great lady, coming from heaven into the Holy of Holies. When she's into the Holy of Holies, those two letters by the black circle and the black square, they are her name as she is known, Shaddai. Shaddai, the lady with breasts. That's what Shaddai means. It doesn't mean almighty, it means the lady with breasts. You remember those figurines? She is the nursing mother. So from her manifestation in the Holy of Holies as the nursing mother, we then have gemination. Gemination, characteristic of this tradition and indeed of Kabbalah, things appearing on both sides, things appearing twice. And here you have the lady appearing twice and flowing down onto the earth. So if you start at the black circle again, and this time come down the black line, so down and along, that shows, that is the line that says Shaddai. And if you take the dotted line from the triangle at the bottom, that says, I will pour out. So the lady is pouring herself out. She is the water that is flowing on either side of the tree of life. Menorah is the tree of life. If you look to the other side and start with the black star, I was beginning to run out of little shapes by this time. You start with a black star, and then you go up and down that solid line, so up to the square and down to the bottom again. That also says the queen. And then if you read the dotted line down from the square, read that around, that also says flowing down or appearing. And so what you have is the waters of life flowing from the upper heavens into the Holy of Holies, and then flowing down on both sides of the tree of life. Very clever pairing, very clever gemination. And I haven't given you this on the screen because it gets too complicated to do. But if you look at the bottom of the tablet and find a black triangle and read those letters out to the left, you've got three letters from the black triangle, read those out to the left. Those read the suckling one or the little plant. And if you read the mirror image of that from the star out to the right, those mean the suckling one who rejoices. So you have the lady flowing from heaven. She geminates in the Holy of Holies. She flows down again. She waters the earth, and she waters her suckling who rejoices. And those are all messianic images. Now that is a relatively simple story interpretation of one of these tablets, but it shows you how images we have in the Bible, the tree of life and the waters flowing. Waters, by the way, are a symbol of wisdom and teaching. And so a parched land is one that has no wisdom teaching and so forth. And polluted waters are bad teaching, poisoned waters. But on that diagram there, you can see how the lady flows down and then separates out and waters the earth. And those titles in the bottom line, the little suckling one and then the suckling one who rejoices, those are titles for the king. And you find those in Isaiah. They describe the Davidic king who receives wisdom from his mother, and he is then able to rule. So that is just a little bit, just a few. I've given you perhaps a dozen diagrams today to show you some of the things that you can read out of this tablet and thus discover a little bit more, first of all, about the Davidic monarchy, and secondly, about what I'm pretty certain is the roots of Kabbalah.
Thank you, Margaret. That was enlightening and really interesting. I think after this second talk, it's really, you can see the intricacies of the teachings in those lead tablets. Yeah. And you can see that they really do seem to come from the first temple in the way that you've described it. Yeah.
Yes, I am pretty certain about that. The task ahead of me is to convince the rest of the world of this outrageous suggestion. But there's just so much evidence.
Yeah. Something occurred to me about the lady, the lady on the pillar. I don't know if it's useful, but what had occurred to me was that, suddenly I've gone into strange sharing, which I didn't mean to do, was that on the tree of life you have Keter, which is the top of the pillar. Yeah. And when it's in menorah form, you have Chokmah and Binah, that Chokmah and Binah form the first holding space. And so it would make sense that Chokmah, Binah, Dart are the first triad. And it would make sense that they would be on the pillar of Keter. They're on the pillar of the center.
No, yes. Now, you see, I can't make the word Keter on that lead tablet, because that lead tablet has five crucial letters of the Hebrew alphabet are missing. Because this particular tablet, as far as I can see, was created after the destruction of the first temple to record what had been lost. And the subtext of this tablet is that the glory has left the temple. And the 5 words for glory in Hebrew begin with 5 different consonants, and those consonants are not used on this lead tablet. And so the obvious one, the word that most people know for glory is kavoth, begins with a kaf, and no word with a kaf in it can be made from this tablet, part of the departed glory. There are other indications of gematria and things like that which back this up. So the vocabulary is very, very limited. The whole thing is done with 17 letters rather than 22. Very, very complicated, very sophisticated.
Do you think it was therefore part of the movement, like Ezekiel's vision of the chariot, part of the movement to try and keep the first temple? Talking about the loss of the first temple.
I'm sure it was part of the movement to keep it, because there are other texts that have survived which say that these tablets were that ancient books were preserved. It doesn't say these tablets. Ancient books were preserved, and the knowledge of how to speak them. So somebody knew that you didn't read this in the ordinary way.
Well, that's another thing that is very striking, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen that, is that just the way that you read these tablets feels ritualistic. It feels like you're participating, perhaps, in the teachings of the priesthood of the first temple. Yeah. And it's not just an intellectual endeavor, it's also kind of an enactment of something that's going on in that
I
creation.
suspect that. I suspect also that the originals of these tablets must have been much, much bigger, and probably that the patterns were drawn out by someone who was kind of holding a rod or a like when they read the Torah now, and pointing out, tracing the lines of the revelation. And that the little tablets that people carried around were simply reminders or even talismans of some sort. But the patterns that emerge from these letters, I mean, I have literally hundreds and hundreds of words now.
Mm.
They must have been drawn out. And see, when Jesus was drawing on the ground, when, the woman taken in adultery, what was he doing? He was writing in the sand. Was he writing letters? Was he drawing a well-known diagram? What was he doing? What was he doing? All sorts of questions arise which can't be answered, but there's enough evidence to say we should ask this question.
And do you have a sense of when the tree of life might have changed from a menorah shape to a more sephirotic shape?
This again is very interesting, because if you look at how the tree of life is depicted in the Mesopotamian carvings that you can see in the British Museum, in the Nineveh Gallery, there the tree of life looks very like a sephirotic tree. It's not like our menorah at all. And yet you have got the king on either side. So you've got a geminated king, and he is doing something, possibly fertilizing the flowers of the tree of life. No idea what he's up to, but he's got a kind of paintbrush and some sort of bucket in his hand. There must have been lots of ways of depicting it, but the fact that the Hebrew uses different words for branch and different sorts of trees and all the rest of it suggests to me that there was a real tree. It wasn't just something you talked about. There was a real tree that represented things, and you have the words for shoot, you've got 2 words, 3 words for branch, all sorts of things. And these are all interchangeable. So there's an awful lot we don't know.
Paul uses the idea of shoots and branches, doesn't he?
Yes, indeed so, and grafting in and all the rest of it. And I mean, the very word Jesus of Nazareth, you see, one of the words for the branch is Netzer, which gives you Nazareth. So was this a kind of wordplay? Was this Jesus the branch as well?
And you mentioned that there were these this female Jew who was being described as someone who is a kind of priestess of the tree.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether that really was a very inept way of describing some of the things that person had overheard, which was about the first temple priesthood and the theology of that, that it was the first temple priesthood was really about everybody being part of the priesthood. And
could well have been that, yes.
Yeah.
But the fact that he can satirize a Jewish refugee as a great priestess of the tree. Now, this is for outsiders. I mean, this section of his satires is about the stupidity of women. And so this is something that the Roman public, the reading Roman public, would have recognized as an example of stupidity of women. A Jewish refugee who could call herself the high priestess of a tree. This was a big joke. Where had he heard this? A very interesting question. Who were these high priestesses of the tree?
That's a really good question.
It's a very good question, and it must have been common knowledge. Otherwise, he was the equivalent of a cartoonist. How did he know that this was the way to make fun of a Jewish refugee?
But it's obviously an oral tradition, and it's obviously been dispersed and is being talked about a lot, isn't it?
And garbled and on all these things. There's just so much. And now we're in the tantalizing position of having the evidence but not all the evidence we would like.
So we're looking at something that could be a small version of what depicted the early Kabbalistic tree in the first temple, which was, of course, the seven-branch menorah.
Yeah.
Would have probably been drawn in other ways, because we can see that in other trees that are around and about, that the and often it's been taught that the menorah has those circles as is depicted in your lead book, and
Yeah.
those become the sephirot, and so it's
Yes.
really added together, four worlds added together in different ways, but certainly it's a sort of easy step for those two to be utilized.
Yes. And if you, the significant parts on that lead tablet are the central lamp, and then going down the stem of the lamp, the three nodes where the branches join it. So that gives you four down the central stem, and then three lamps on either side, and that gives you exactly the tree, the original tree, the four in the center and then three on either side. So when they moved them around, I have no idea. That's a research job for a real Kabbalist to go into, but it is very, very interesting that the lights, the lamps on the lead tablet are very significant. And also the nodes where the branches intersect also are very significant. The ones that intersect at the top branch are about the Messiah, for example. Almost certainly the ones that intersect at the bottom node are about incarnation.
Yeah.
And that, you know, all sorts of things like this. And then the second and third intersections are to do with something, qualities of the Queen of Heaven. These are all things to investigate, but they are significant.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I can't see that there are any questions in the chat actually now.
Oh, that's all right.
We're all quite overwhelmed with so much information. But if I may, I'm going to ask you a strange question, coming from a different angle, because you and I had a discussion about the Sefer Yetzirah
Yeah.
a while ago, about which Abraham it might have been written by, and I thought people might be interested in hearing your ideas about them.
Well, I have these. Now, there is not a lot of evidence to back this up. It's just something that, you know, the story of Elijah, the cloud the size of a man's hand that eventually got rather big and brought the rain. This is a cloud the size of a man's hand. But Abraham, who is linked to the Sefer Yetzirah, in the broader tradition of the development of Old Testament religion, Abraham represents the religion of the people before Moses. In other words, he represents the older beliefs. And I do wonder, when you have the suggestion that things were revealed to Abraham, that these indicate beliefs that were revealed and codified in the older religion, and that we're not looking for a rabbi in the early Christian period who was called Rabbi Abraham. We're actually receiving in a coded form a belief that this is a deposit of the pre-Moses faith, the old believers.
It would make sense.
It would make a lot of sense. Yeah.
That it is as well. It's so symbolic and the experience of reading it is quite similar to the experience of looking at the lead books in a way, isn't it?
It is very much so. Now, I've seen two things popped into chat. Let's see what it says.
One of them says, would you say that the writing for the lead books are a form of speaking silently, which is interesting. It's about the devotion, but also maybe about carrying that teaching from the first temple in safely.
Silent speaking is what's associated with the Isaiah tradition. Woe is me, for I kept silent. Woe is me, for I was a silent one. And teachings handed on in silence could well have been handed on by tracing out the patterns on a tablet and never actually voicing them. There was a tradition amongst the early Christians, mentioned specifically by St. Basil the Great, who said that certain things cannot be spoken because they are beyond words, which is quite interesting. So that is certainly a possibility, a form of speaking in silence and tracing the patterns on these things. And you gazed and you watched as these things were, if you like, demonstrated before you. Now, the next one, Cynthia, I noticed that in the lead books, you noted the words compassion and counselor. Those do not go to the earth portion, but the temple second heaven, up to the uppermost heavens. Do you think there is significance in that? Yes, where the words appear on the tablet, which zone they appear in, and which zones they link together it's becoming clear to me, more and more significant. Some things come direct from heaven to earth. Some things only come as far as the Holy of Holies. Some things flow from the Holy of Holies. There are a lot of parts in where you can trace the origin of Isaiah's oracles, where righteousness sprouts up from the earth, and that starts at the bottom, and the words go upwards. So there is certainly a lot of that. Yes. What's the next one? From Max. More of a comment than a question. Josephus talks about the loot taken from the temple. He notes that the menorah, wait a minute, he notes that the menorah was terrible. It not, it had been, and the Romans made it a trident. That's a very interesting comment, worth pondering, Max. Thank you. The word appearing that you read on the tablet, that's very interesting. Now, that's a curious word that only appears once, only found in the classical Hebrew lexical stock in the Song of Songs. And this is where it is like, where the lady's hair is like a flock of goats coming down a mountainside. But the Greek translated this word as appearing. And this is one of the many, many words that sometimes don't make sense, certainly don't make sense if you are reading using only the traditional Hebrew lexicons. But recently, David Klein's, he died only a few months ago, David Klein's produced a huge and amazing new dictionary, many, many volumes, including not just the words in the Hebrew scriptures, but also the other known classical Hebrew words from inscriptions, all sorts of places, and the scrolls. And we've now got, our knowledge of ancient Hebrew words has increased hugely. And looking in that dictionary, you can find lots of words that you could identify lots of words in the lead books that you couldn't identify if you only use the great classical dictionaries like Brown, Driver and Briggs, which we were all brought up on. So David's work has been indispensable, for this work, and I'm only sad that he didn't live to see my work completed, but that's the way things are.
A final question here from Michael. What are the 4 missing letters, and do they represent realities that are silent and ineffable?
Now, that is a very interesting question. They might do, is the answer. They do seem to be the initial letters of important items from the cult. That's something I'm actually working on at the moment, so that's a work in progress. The letters that are missing are Zayin, Kaf, Samek, Pei, and Tate. Had to go through the alphabet of my fingers to work out what wasn't there. But that's for the lead tablet. Now, there are other tablets that do have some of those letters, but this tablet, which seems to be about the departed glory, doesn't have in it the letters that are the 5 letters for the departed glory. If you look, those of you who use a Hebrew text, if you look in Haggai chapter 1, I think it's verse 8, this is where the Lord describes the building of the second temple. And he says, build a temple that I may appear in my glory, or that I may appear in glory. And this word is not spelt the usual way. You would expect that I may appear in glory to have the letter hey on the end of it. That would be the correct grammatical form. But it's always written without the hey, because a hey is also the Hebrew numeral 5, and that is to remind you that 5 aspects or elements of the glory of the Lord were missing from the second temple. And those 5 missing elements are represented by those 5 missing letters in the lead book. It's all a huge network of interconnected traditions, and just below the surface, it's very it's fascinating and it's frustrating.
That's fascinating, thank you. And it was really good to have that question from Michael, who himself has written on Kabbalah and loves language. So
yes,
I wonder after a week of thinking about it, what he'll make of that. I can't wait.
Well, I would love to hear all suggestions and help, desperately needed, and would be most welcome. This is such a massive job that, I can take all recruits, really.
It's really kind of you to share it with us, Margaret. It's been absolutely delightful to share it, to hear all the Bible quotes and the really interesting research that we have, to get more and more of a vivid sense of what that first temple devotion was like, and then to really experience what it is to go into the lead books in that silent, kind of devotional, symbolic way. Fantastic. Thank you so much. We really look forward to the next one, which is in fact happening on the Sunday, the 30th of April, everybody. That's the next one. And that's going to be talking about the ascent, our ascent, the ascent. You're looking really interested to hear that one. So
the ascent and the descent, coming down again.
The ascent and the descent.
Yes. So it's be up and down the tree.
Yes.
So that's 5 weeks. 5 weeks time, right? Okay, well, I look forward to that very much.
Wonderful. Thanks
Okay,
everyone
bye-bye.
for coming.